Welcome to Practice Excellence Live 2017. This session is brought to you in association with Thomson Reuters and is all about the European General Data Protection Regulation. I'm John Stockdyke, the Global Editor of Accounting Web, and I've got with me an expert panel to talk all about GDPR. The reason for this session is that we've all had our minds focused on making tax digital for the past year. And now that the deadline related on that, which we heard about in a separate podcast with Thomson Reuters, a lot of firms are actually discovering there's an even more imminent compliance challenge coming down the pipeline that comes into effect in May 2018. So just to get more of an idea of that, we've got Victoria Tuffle, who's the Managing Director of Data Compliant, Ian Cooper, who's a Product Manager with Thomson Reuters, and Dave Jenner, who's Dave Tucker. Dave Tucker from Thomson Jenner. It's the Thompsons that threw me there. So Thomson Jenner, an accountant from Exeter. They're going to give us their perspectives on this issue for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to leave a session for Q&As. If you've got any problems besides remembering the names of your guests and want to catch up with this broadcast later, we'll be putting the whole thing on YouTube so you can come back and view it again. We'll also be summarising the points that have been made and put them out in a PDF that will go to anybody who's registered for this event. And finally, as I say, it is interactive. Next to where you're watching this on screen is a little chat box. You can type in any questions there. I'll pick them up on my iPad, and once we've kind of covered the basics, we'll have that session where you can put your questions to the panel. But just to warm us up, really, Victoria, can you get us started? What brought you to talk to a bunch of accountants about this issue? How has it sort of come onto your plate?
Well, I've worked with data now since the early 1980s, and my focus has been on how to use it and abuse it. And in the 80s, I did some terrible things with it. In the 90s, obviously, I became aware of the Data Protection Act, and that became quite important. And my focus in the last 20 years has been on data protection and helping organisations stay the right side of the data protection laws. So GDPR has turned up. It's been around a while. It was made law in May 2016. It will be enforced from May 2018. And even though professional organisations, one would expect to be very well versed in the compliance regulations that are coming around the corner, because there's so much of it, this one seems to have kind of drifted through the net a bit. And it's only recently that we've started seeing professionals like accountancy firms actually starting to take notice and worry about GDPR. And one of the issues that they've got is, while it's been law for 17 odd months, they now only have until May to be completely compliant. And even though the Information Commissioner has been very remiss is the wrong word, it's unfair, but slow to provide guidance, that deadline of May the 25th is absolutely firm in the sand. It's not going to change, it's not going to move. So with or without guidance, actually everybody has to be ready for it, and that includes accountants. So that's really why I'm there, just to sort of see if I can help give some thoughts and advice.
Well, we appreciate your presence here today. Ian, what's your sort of take on this from the Thomson Reuters angle?
Oh, hi there, John. Yeah, we've, personally speaking, I've been working in IT since for the last 20 years, since the last Data Protection Act was written and brought into law. So the way computer usage in personal data has changed over the last few years is quite phenomenal. So from the cybersecurity point of view, I'm very interested in the technology solutions that can help accountancy firms protect the personal data that they hold. As a product manager with several products under my wing, I've got responsibility for several of our cloud products where accountancy firms are entrusting us to help protect their personal data of their clients. So that's one area I'm particularly interested in. But on the flip side, they use our software and install the software locally. So very interested in ways that we need to help protect the personal data that our clients are entering in the software packages.
And Dave, you're a practicing accountant. How did it arrive on your plate, and what's your perspective on it?
Well, as a firm of chartered accountants, we're what you'd understand as sort of a typical mid-tier firm of accountants with about 80 members of staff. So we hold, we receive and we process a massive amount of personal data, including being outsourced for a significant amount of payroll data as well. So I think I was actually late turning up to the partners meeting where they were kindly handing out responsibilities. So my fellow partners very kindly gave me the task of overseeing GDPR as far as its compliance and how that's going to be implemented for our firm. So to be honest, the first thing I did was Google GDPR to see what it actually meant, and then from there it went.
Oh, you got past the hospital pass there. So let's just get us started maybe, Victoria. Can you just kind of pull together what are the main things, the main elements of the GDPR and what are our viewers going to have to concentrate on?
Certainly. So the GDPR is the General Data Protection Regulation. It was created in Europe. It is going to be pan-European. Interestingly, it's also going to apply to countries that are not based in Europe but who process European data. So the real purpose of GDPR is to bring data protection law up to date into the 21st century. Because you were talking earlier, Ian, about in the 80s the Data Protection Act came into force. Well, in the 80s we didn't have the internet. We didn't have social media. We didn't talk to each other in the ways that we talk to each other now. We didn't have big data. All these things have evolved over the last 20 years, and GDPR is, at least in part, designed to bring the legislation up to speed with where we are now, which is quite tricky because actually technology is still moving on and it's not going to stop just because we've got a bit of law in place to solve that problem. The other issue about GDPR is it is designed to give control back to the people whose data you're processing. So it's power back to the individual, and all the responsibility for protecting that data falls on the people who are processing it, or the firms or the accountancy practices. So one of the key things about GDPR is that everything you do should be transparent and fair, and therefore every individual needs to be notified of what it is that you're going to do with their personal data. One of the new things that GDPR demands is the principle of accountability. So you have to keep records, you have to know the data that you've got, and you have to evidence everything that you're doing with that data. And there's loads more, but I'll stop for now and we can come back and ask questions on specific things.
So Ian, there's the technology change going on. We've talked about tax digitisation imposing certain demands on practitioners' time. How is GDPR intersecting with these other pressures on practitioners at the moment? And
I think GDPR or MTD has been definitely the focus of practitioners for the past 12 to 18 months. And now the dust is settling with the postponement until 2019 for the introduction of MTD. Firms are now beginning to seriously think and look at and work out some plans around how they're going to deal with GDPR. We have noticed an increase in the number of people contacting us, proactively asking for information about how we can help them. And we recently ran a webinar with 1,500 plus people registered for that, or 1,500 of our clients registered for that. So the interest levels are ramping up, and ramping up quite quickly. One of the questions that we asked during that poll or webinar was how many of you have started discussing this internally, and 50% or thereabouts of firms actually have started discussing it internally. 10% of firms aren't going to discuss it and are still, well, they don't think it's going to happen, but as we've heard from Victoria, they've got 7-8 months now to actually put some plans in place to deal with this. So yes, it is getting a bit more focus. How much of that focus will remain on the run up to the 31st of January with tax season just on the horizon? I don't know, but I think February onwards is going to see quite a lot of noise around this topic.
so Dave, and with that deadline looming, what kind of challenges is it posing for you and your colleagues?
Well, certainly, as we mentioned previously, we hold so much information on a personal nature, and we also receive on a daily basis so much information as well. So the challenges really to start with was understanding, what exactly do the regulations tell us what we have to actually do with that. And also understanding the practical implications of what those regulations are. Because we operate in a highly regulated industry as it is. And this is another set of rules, another set of regulations which we're having to comply with. And we're always time poor when it comes to dealing with things. So it's thinking, how can we actually approach this? And so a couple of questions for Victoria, if that's okay, because initially when I was looking at what do these regulations mean for us, because we hold so much confidential information, in my mind I initially attached that to that it was sensitive data as far as the regulations were concerned. Now my understanding is just because it's confidential in nature doesn't necessarily mean that it falls into the scope of sensitive?
No, it doesn't. So under the DPA you have personal data and you have sensitive personal data. GDPR is exactly the same, except they call it special category data. Special category or sensitive data is limited, very clearly defined. So it's health data, it's sexual orientation, it's whether or not you're a member of a trade union. It's that kind of data. Accountants hold all sorts of levels of data. They hold client data, they've got their own staff data, which is something that shouldn't be forgotten, because HR and how you treat your staff also falls under GDPR. So you have personal data, you have personally identifiable. So personal data is your name, your address, for example. That's a classic case of personal data. Personally identifiable data is data that you hold about an individual that either on its own or in combination with other data that you might already hold or that might come into your area at some point allows you to identify that individual. And special category data we just talked about. What accountants also hold an enormous amount of is confidential data, and it doesn't fall under the category of sensitive data, but it does need to be carefully protected. And by its very nature, it has to be very carefully protected. But equally so would something like a national insurance number, which is personally identifiable data. You lose some of the data that you currently hold on an individual, and there are two things that can happen. The data you hold by its very nature allows identity thieves to have an absolute field day. And the confidential nature of the data means that nobody actually wants everybody to be able to see what's going on, payroll. You don't want to see what somebody's earning, etc. So those are the kinds of data that accountants would typically deal with.
Because you mentioned payroll as well, and we must receive thousands and thousands of information on a daily basis, just with payroll alone, for example. So when looking at the regulations, could potentially accountants who process a lot of personal data fall into the category of a large processor and therefore much more stringent under the regulations?
Yes. So if you are a large-scale processor of personal data, you may fall under the requirement of needing to appoint a data protection officer. It's one of the things that is mandated under GDPR in certain circumstances. Unhelpfully, they haven't actually specified what is a large-scale processing. They haven't defined the number. But in the same way that an organisation that handles a lot of data on behalf of its clients, for example, for programmatic advertising or retargeting, would probably have to appoint a data protection officer if they have a lot of clients whose data they're processing. I think accountants, I see no reason why accountants wouldn't fall into that category.
Okay, so
and also given the nature of your business, which demands that you process data in order to fulfill your actual objectives for your clients. So on those two counts, I think there's a real possibility that certainly large size accountancy firms will need to consider appointing a data protection officer. One thing I will just throw in there, if you don't have to, but you choose to because it's best practice, and it is best practiced and it's definitely preferred, I would call your voluntary data protection officer something quite different from data protection officer, because under GDPR, if you appoint a voluntary data protection officer, everything that a mandated data protection officer has to do in terms of whistleblowing to the ICO and so on and so forth comes into force.
Okay.
So you need to call them a compliance officer or something quite different to avoid that little hurdle.
Right.
Okay, so those are a lot of the legal definitions in GDPR, and it's really actually helpful to kind of get those traps sort of set out ahead of you. But will the regulation actually change what accountants do? You know, will they have to adjust and alter what their processes or their policies?
I think they will. I think accountants will have to take stock of all the data that they hold and the different kinds of data that they hold. And they will have to be mindful of the principle of accountability, which is brand new. It never existed under the Data Protection Act. So under the Data Protection Act, you would register with the Information Commissioner, you tell them broadly speaking what you intended to do with the data that you held and the sorts of data that you held, and you'd pay them a fee, and that would be it. Under GDPR, that requirement no longer exists. You have to have records of all the data that you're processing, what you're processing it for, all the decisions you make about that data. So that is absolutely fundamental and new. And I think given what you were talking about, Ian, about the different places that you can send this data and where it sits and the different repositories and where it ends up, that's actually not as straightforward as it sounds. And the other thing about accountants, and we were talking about, Dave, the sorts of data that accountancy firms hold, Principle 6 of General Data Protection Regulation, which is the one that deals with security, is absolutely critical. And that's all about encryption, that's about pseudonymizing or anonymizing the data, it's about proper access controls, it's about taking responsibility for making sure that that data is safe, and that obviously is where you have a lot of experience.
We have a question which maybe Ian can pick up from us, but Paul in Leeds was concerned, speaking about the way accountants work. He says, can I continue to email a non-password protected tax return and paste it to a client? So what words of comfort do you have for Paul, Ian?
It's a very good question. It is a very good question. Now, that we're getting asked a lot of times about this. Now, from a technology point of view, we have a portal solution in place, and that is definitely a preferred method. Now, there is a regulation called PECA, which has been around for several years, and they're trying to tie that up with GDPR. Now, PECA deals with the personal way that electronic communications are regulated, and I'm sure there's a little bit more information to do with tying these two bits of regulation up.
I think your portal idea sounds absolutely terrific, because sending any kind of financial records unencrypted via email in my world is, I question it under the Data Protection Act, let alone under GDPR. PECA is an interesting one. PECA is the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations, and it defines any digital communications that you have with anybody, whether it's email or text or online. It's a difficult area at the moment because it's under review in Europe. The e-privacy regulation is under review in Europe. PECA came into being, it was designed to fit around the Data Protection Act, the current PECA regulations. And the difficulty is that they don't quite fit under GDPR, because GDPR has more onerous requirements, if you like. So PECA is currently going through Europe, or the e-privacy regulation is going through Europe at the moment. The idea is it will land at the same time as GDPR, but nobody knows what's in it yet. And the last set of amendments had about 800 amendments over the January kind of consultation document. Having said that, they really are pushing it through as quickly as they can. They're really making an effort to move it along. But whether or not it'll be ready for May the 25th is another matter, and that will cause some confusion over what can and cannot be done legitimately with your electronic communications. So one of the things that's being debated at the moment is whether or not a business-to-business email communication can be considered legitimate interest, or whether you require consent, or marketing in the same way.
We've got sort of two associated questions with that, and that is password protecting a PDF and attaching it to an email, a PDF with an individual's tax return, for example. And the second method for sending tax returns to client is in the post.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about those two?
Oh, post's great. Love the post.
Right.
No, I love the post for everything, actually, because nobody ever uses direct mail anymore, and that means that when a piece of direct mail arrives on your doorstep, it works really well. It's enjoying a real renaissance. And direct mail...
But is it secure from the general data protection?
Yeah, absolutely.
If it doesn't arrive, would the firm need to report a breach?
No.
Okay.
I didn't say that. The firm would need to evaluate the scale of the problem and decide whether or not they should report that breach.
Okay.
One piece of mail going astray, you'd have to assess the risks.
But it sounds like Paul in Leeds and a few other practitioners are going to have to be reviewing their communication
Definitely.
processes.
Yeah.
Dave, we've already just heard the scale of some of the changes people are going to need to make between now and May. Where did you start? What's the first step you think you need to take to just start getting on this road to compliance?
Well, after I got kindly volunteered by my colleagues, the first one was understanding what actually the regulations actually involved, and that sort of set out the kind of, parameters of what we were working with. The second was undertaking sort of a data mapping exercise, which was saying, well, what data do we hold? How do we hold that data? And what data do we actually receive? And once we understand that concept, it was undertaking a gap analysis. And that was really understanding what the threat landscape was. So we were looking at, understanding the different threats in the landscape was looking at the people, looking at the processes which we currently have, and also looking at the technology as well, which closely aligns with what you're saying about the need for encryption. Is it acceptable going forward to send emails without password protection? Is there other methods available, such as portals or other forms of encryption software, to be able to help with that? So really understanding how it was, and that will then start building into a roadmap of what need to be done to ensure compliance. Now, a lot of this is understanding as well. So as a firm, we've actually brought in a qualified DPO to give us a talk, to the partners, to be able to discuss through what the regulations actually require, but also ensuring that we have sufficient staff awareness and staff training, which is something which we're encouraging from the top down for this, so we can ensure that all our members of staff are actually working towards for that compliance.
Okay, we touched on the idea of just communication of sending data in and out to the clients. Ian, you're looking at processes and systems within the firms. Will much have to change about how the firm manage, the information flows within the firms? Will they be impacted, and will your software be directly affected by GDPR requirements?
Potentially, yes. Or in fact, it will. Dave just mentioned about the fact that you review how much data you've got. You look at whether it's needed, and if it's not needed, get rid of it. Data minimisation is a theme that's running through GDPR all the time. If a member of staff requests data about one of their clients and they want it emailed between the people in the firm, really question the requirement for that. So yes, the internal communications aspect of it, especially in some of the larger firms where there's multi-office and data does leave the building, that really needs to be an area during this stage of running a data inventory of where data is sent. The more frequently data is moved from one place to another, the higher the risk of a data breach. So yes, there will be need to be more controls in place about this. I think it doesn't necessarily have to be as daunting as it's beginning potentially to sound, because once there is a base level of understanding about how to protect data, then one member of staff won't be necessarily saying, oh, could you just send me the tax return for that for client A, B or C? They know that client A, B or C is in the relevant filing place in a document management system, for example. So yeah, it will become second nature not to ask for something to be emailed between staff, and they will know the right place to go in the firm's network.
And talking about emails as well, I think with the regulations coming in next year, we're probably going to see an increase of the data subject actually asking for information to be provided of all correspondence in relation to themselves. Now, of course, that will include internal emails. So I think that a focus for firms is obviously thinking about how they, talk, email, communicate internally, and that potentially this internal communication could actually be caught up in a sort of a data subject request for information on that individual.
So for example, if you were to be a little bit worried that one of your clients was doing something that might not quite be right, and you were to send an email to somebody saying, how do you think we should handle this, because I think this person has done something perhaps slightly untoward, and it may or may not be deliberate, and I think he's a crooked beast, or I think he's just misled. That is personal data, and if that person subsequently asks you for their personal data, you will be obliged to send them that email. that describes them, because that is an opinion, it's written down, it's personal
Yeah,
data.
I mean, have
And
you
similarly,
made any adjustments for your email policies internally already to accommodate that scenario?
Absolutely, absolutely. We actually communicated this to all members of staff only recently to be able to say, under the regulations, this is something which we could potentially see more of, and therefore when we do internal communications, to do the internal communication as if we were emailing externally, because potentially that could be, you know, caught up in some kind of request. So absolutely, it's sort of like educating the staff.
and the other thing actually, well, we're talking about staff subject access requests. If you have a meeting and you are discussing the performance of a member of staff and that's minuted, that is personal information too. So if you get a staff subject access request, you have to provide that to them. So it's not, it really does need some serious thinking.
The other area that sort of extends into the world of, I understand, on Accounting Web is where we're sending out a lot of communications to our members about things, and then we send out sort of, we think you might be interested in this this live webcast we're doing about GDPR. How will it impact marketing for the firm? So when they start to want, you know, there's the daily to and fro emails, but what about the marketing activity?
I think for every piece of data that you process, you have to have a legal grounds for processing it, and some of that's for fulfillment of contract, which would be a lot of what you guys are doing. Some of that is for a legitimate interest, and in order to decide whether something is a legitimate interest, you have to run a balancing act that says I, the organisation, have the following interest in this, and the rights of the individual to whom I'm sending this are impacted in the following ways. And there's a process whereby you actually end up with a balance, and marketing may fall under the auspices of legitimate interest. So something like direct mail, that's probably legitimate interest. The difficulty, when we go back to the whole issue of PECA, is that there's a big debate going on at the moment as to whether or not marketing business to business is considered legitimate interest or not, or may be considered legitimate interest. And that's a discussion that's ongoing.
So at the moment, accountants may not have to say, you know, please tick this box so I can send you intro.
So consent is the third, if you like, of the grounds. And consent is required, and consent is required where you rely on consent as the grounds for processing. It has to be affirmative, so no pre-tick tick boxes. They're gone, they're a thing of the past, and frankly, not before time. So no pre-tick boxes. It has to be, you have to inform them what you're going to do with the data, and that information has to be specific. So where you can't rely on legitimate interest, you will be relying on consent, and that really does have some constraints.
Although in your case, Dave, I mean, is this something you've put in your letters of engagement? You say, you know, we will send you information and look after it under the GDPR, but also send you stuff we feel to be of legitimate interest. So you almost get the consent in the engagement letter.
And that's one of the practical considerations which are coming in force now, that we're having to re-look at all our engagement letters, to have the engagement letters reworded to specifically, you know, to approach GDPR, but also looking at any contracts we have with other individuals as well, to ensure that, you know, the regulations have been covered off sufficiently with that.
Now, we've set the cat amongst the pigeons here, and we're getting a lot of questions in on the Cover It Live. I think the DPO issues popped up, and there's a few more. So we are pretty much getting to the end of the formal presentation, but there's a lot. I think we'll be going for another 15 minutes at least, trying to handle the audience questions. But just to wrap things up, let's sort of summarise what we do, or not so much. We have set out some of the challenges. Maybe, you know, if I ask each one of you, you know, what your one tip that people take away from today is. So if you know, we've got 7 months to comply with GDPR. Where do you think our viewers should start? What's your one tip?
Okay. Like I said earlier, you can't get paralysed by this, and I think the best way of starting to get ready for May next year is to run an inventory of the personal data, work out all of the locations of it, whether it be in company secretary software or practice management, payroll, HR, CRM, etc. Run that personal data inventory. Look at where the more confidential data lies. And then cross-reference that with how much data there is. That will give you your first places to look, your first places to start writing privacy impact policies around certain categories of data. It's probably something that a lot of practitioners have wanted to do for ages. It's a bit of a spring clean of the data that they hold on their system. That's probably the task to do after January and has been for the last 5 years. So it can be a cathartic exercise, and don't be daunted by it.
So Victoria, what's your key priority?
I think I completely concur with Ian. I think that is an absolute essential first step. Depending on which piece of research you read, anywhere between 54 and 83% of data breaches are caused by inadvertent human error. And that means that everybody in your organisation has to know about GDPR, how to comply with it, and PECA, when we know what PECA is going to look like, but we have PECA now, so that's what we're stuck with working within. So training every single member of staff who ever handles any piece of personal data, to me, is absolutely critical. And I would absolutely countenance everybody to do that. I'm going to cheat and add a second tip, if
You're
I may.
allowed, Victoria.
Your privacy notice is the window by which people can look in and see what your practices are. And if your privacy notice is not good enough, you will lose your competitive advantage, you'll lose trust, etc. Not only that, you are open for somebody like the Information Commissioner to have a look and go, oh, they don't look as though they know what they're doing with their personal data. So I would suggest that everybody looks at their privacy notices and gets them in line with the advice that the Information Commissioner has given so far, as a minimum, immediately. Because I have to be honest, knowing that I was coming here today, I looked at a lot of accountancy privacy notices over the weekend, and they're pretty poor by and large. They all do the cookie stuff very well, but they do not talk about the personal data, where it's held, what they do with it, what its purpose is, why they're processing it, where they send it, who their data protection officer is, if they have one. All of that stuff is missing. And I didn't find one that was adequate.
Sorry. If we have time, I might come back to that. So Dave, you're living it. You know, what's your starting point? And
starting point is definitely take ownership of this. As we sort of mentioned earlier, you know, we're already a highly regulated industry. There is so much going on all the time. We always seem to be incredibly time poor. We're always focusing on the next deadline. As mentioned earlier, we've got tax returns coming up at the end of January, but these regulations are coming, you know, enforceable from May next year. So it's really take ownership, you know, dedicate the time needed in order to undertake all those practical steps to ensure compliance by that particular point.
Thank you. Okay, well, as I say, the questions are bubbling along. A lot of them are sort of going back to some of the things we said along the way. I guess the most recent one kind of was a follow-on from the email tax returns. And again, Ian, I'm looking at you because it's quite a technology one. These days, people are using Google Drive or SharePoint or our old favourite Dropbox as the portal. And again, they wanted to know about the, you know, what's the use of that? Call, you know, what's the risk there for sole practitioners?
Each of these companies, global companies that hold data, if you do searches on their website, you'll find their take on GDPR and what they're doing to comply with it. For example, there was the Privacy Shield, which was for where your data resides in the US, that you've entered onto servers. The Privacy Shield is a piece of regulation that's been around for some time. But in terms of storing tax return information, etc., then go to your preferred supplier's website and do a search on their contracts to read their privacy statement and see how this data is going to be used. So, because they are a processor and they're potentially going to outsource elements of their system to sub-processors.
Okay, then I guess, Victoria, your DPO, your tip about not calling it a DPO, but I think you know, our audience, there's a lot of small practitioners and sole practitioners out there. I think they got a little bit frightened about the idea suddenly of they may need to appoint a data protection officer. So where do they get accredited? Will a small practitioner need a DPO? And where do they get accredited if they do take someone on?
As I said, it's very unhelpful that there is no definition of large-scale processing. I think a small practitioner is unlikely to need a DPO. I would advise anybody in any doubt to go to the ICO and ring them up. Just Google ICO, have a look at their website. They have a helpline. So if they're concerned that they might need to appoint a DPO under GDPR, and they know, don't ring the ICO before they know how much data they're processing. So they will have had to have gone through the exercise of knowing the volumes of data and so on and so forth. But I would absolutely countenance it, because the ICO gives free advice, so use it.
Although again, the ICO, or you had a question?
Sorry, yeah, just on the ICO. So I understand the Information Commissioner's Office, or
Yep.
ICO,
So, yeah.
are still yet to publish their full end-to-end guidance, and their end-to-end guidance, in theory, should cover aspects of a definition of a large-scale processor. Have we got any idea when that guidance is meant to be published?
No, we have a draft consent guidance which was produced much earlier in the year, and the Working Party 29 is publishing its consent guidance in December, so the ICO won't publish anything until after that.
Right.
So you're looking at December, January. Profiling and other automated data processing. There was a consultation document. I can't remember when I first read it. I think it was probably March, April. Anyway, it was again earlier in the year. There's been nothing since then. So it is unhelpful.
Okay,
It really is.
Don't want to sort of necessarily, well, it's not so much kicking them, but also, will the Commissioner's role change significantly under the GDPR? Is it a new regime and environment for them?
It's essentially a different regulation for them to regulate. The way they're going to be funded will change. Up until now, any accountancy firm should have registered under the Data Protection Act with the Information Commissioner, because they are data controllers.
Have you already done that before you've got into you're one of the good firms who's did that? Because I think the compliance level's a little bit weak there, but we'll pass over that.
So for a smallish company, it's a £35 fee, and you just have to tell them what data you're collecting and processing, and it's pretty simple. It's a 20-minute exercise. You can do it online. If you're a larger organisation with more than 250 employees and 25 point something million pounds turnover, the fee goes up to £500. Under GDPR, that registration in that form is no longer required, but you will be required to pay a data protection fee, and that fee is going to be quite an interesting one, because it's not only going to be based on number of staff and turnover, but also the volume of data you process. And that, for me, I think that is great news, because it encourages what you were talking about earlier, Ian, data minimization, which is a key part of GDPR. Only keep the data you need for the purposes that you need it. You're meant to have a retention and deletion policy, so there is a period of time over which, and you're meant to set that as a policy. That's part of your record keeping. So making volume part of that fee encourages a proper retention policy to be developed. So yeah, that's how that'll work. But I think it is worth noting there are a lot of people who are running around scaremongering and saying, oh, the ICO is going to levy huge fines. You know, it's 4% of global turnover, or 20 million euro. And what nobody seems to remember is that actually, since DPA was invented, for want of a better term, the ICO has never once levied a £500,000 fine, which it is perfectly entitled to. Even TalkTalk,
Yes.
on the second occasion, only got 400,000. The ICO is there to help and advise, and if there is a breach and it's inadvertent and you're a small business and you made a mistake, genuinely, the lowest level of punitive action, if you like, is a kind of rap on the wrists with a letter, and then they'll probably offer to give you a hand, you know, to set you up with some processes. And
I think there's a lot of sort of, initial scaremongering about this. I think a lot of firms are probably looking at this thinking, what do we have to do to stay compliant? But I think there's definitely opportunities in relation to this as well, because, as a firm of accountants, we have direct communication with our clients on a regular basis. Now, our clients are going through a similar process of thinking, what do we have to do? So as a firm of accountants, we're actually putting that down as an agenda item to talk to our clients, because we're not in a position to be able to give them guidance, but we can talk through the issues with them and put them in contact with people to be able to offer a solution to this. So it's an extra way of being able to add value to our clients, and to be honest, it sets you slightly apart from the mundane, normal accountancy compliance work. How can we actually add value? Well, let's talk to our clients about GDPR. Let's talk to them. Let's put them in contact. I mean, it's great. One of my clients, has developed an e-learning solution. So fantastic. Let's talk about that. Let's give them some positive solutions of making their life a little bit easier for this.
Yeah, this bit about the advisory, offering that advisory service. If they can see you're on top of this, and you're going to get guidance from your relevant accountancy bodies, but if they can see you're on top of this and understand it, they're going to trust you more. The more they trust you, the more information they're going to give you about them personally and their financial wealth and about their business. So there are some great opportunities, I think.
It gives you a real competitive edge.
Absolutely.
It really does.
I think reputation is key for this. If they've got confidence in you, that you are being compliant, and when they pass information to you, you are going to treat it in the way which they expect and in the way which the regulations, demand of this, they're going to be so much more confident and so much more willing to recommend you. So it's a great thing.
MC has, we'll return to that just before we wrap up, but MC has kind of raised a spectre that, another of these pressures on the profession, which is the anti-money laundering regulations. And I think it was your idea of the personal request for information, request for personal information. MC's considered under AML, they may have, if an accountant is aware of any slightly dodgy activity, they don't just write in a memo around to colleagues. They're obligated to notify the file a suspicious activity report, and MC's worried, is this putting them at risk of tipping off, which is again itself a crime under the anti-money laundering regulations. What is the interplay of those two regimes?
Well, every kind of business has its own regulatory laws that it has to follow. So there are, for example, retention policies that have to be put together under GDPR, but you have to keep certain records for a specific amount of time. Other regulations will continue to be enforced, and they will work together.
Okay.
So GDPR doesn't actually take away any of the other regulatory requirements that you have, or change them.
But would there be an exemption for if you have filed?
Oh, certainly. I'm so sorry. Yes, of course there is. Yeah.
Okay.
So there are exemptions. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. We have also, just again to throw make sure we pay attention to all the points. So a question about the Brexit effect. What will happen if we do leave? Because this is a European directive, so can we not just walk away from it in 2019?
I think there are a number of reasons why we can't walk away from it. One is it's already embedded in our own data protection bill that's going through Parliament at the moment in full. GDPR is in there. It's part of that bill, so it will become British law. I actually think that even if we were to leave Brexit, the Information Commissioner has made it perfectly plain that if we want to trade with Europe with data, we have to have at least equivalent of GDPR. So there's certainly no appetite there to dumb it down. And to be honest, I think the government's going to have enough on its plate with legislation that doesn't make quite as much sense as GDPR, that GDPR is going to be pretty low down on its list of things to change. I really don't think GDPR is going anywhere.
Okay, Louise was querying what we were saying about Dropbox and Google Drive, saying these aren't information processing things, they're just storage mechanisms. But I think the point there, Louise, is that they're like Ian's portal. It's a place where you put the data that the client can access to. So it's a secure transfer mechanism. But again, things like Dropbox don't necessarily have that same level of security of a sort of more professional solution. So that's why we were talking about it in that context. We are getting right to the end. Maybe come back to you, David. So you were talking about the opportunities and what it enables to do. Can you sort of give us some examples of how you are actually doing this with your client and how it plays out?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we started off by actually running a joint seminar. So as I mentioned, a client of ours has actually created an e-learning training solution for this. So ourselves, our client, and also another firm of lawyers actually got together and held a seminar for our clients to be able to talk through the regulations coming up for this. We're also, on our agenda items, when we go out to have meetings with clients, we're actually putting this down as an agenda item to talk through, you know, are they aware of it? Are they taking steps? Yeah. And also helping with the solution for that. We'll also look at any other opportunities we have. So for example, we're coming up with the autumn budget coming up soon. We hold a budget breakfast. So we have allocated 15 minutes time slot as part of the budget breakfast to go through GDPR again. So we're just looking at opportunities which are there to be able to use that as a way to be able to communicate to our clients in this respect.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a good point to finish on, because you know, this, like all these other compliance challenges a profession faces, it is always about getting the information out there and educating your own teams and your clients. So that's what this has been all about. It's been a whirlwind 45 minutes. I think we've taken in a lot. It's worth watching again. I think I really got a lot out of that. So thank you, Victoria,
Thank you.
Ian and David. It's a big step forward for us on Accounting Web, and I hope our viewers that it is a serious challenge. The timelines are always short, but I think, you know, with information, with education, you know, that's how the profession always responds to this. So I hope we can help you on your journey to GDPR, and do come back. I'm sure we'll talk about it at Practice Excellence Live next year, where it'll be a little bit more pressing. So thanks for viewing.